Let's get into something a little bit more interesting. So typically with JSON, it's used to send data back and forth over the web using AJAX calls, which we are going to be looking at later on. And in this lesson, I want to introduce you to what AJAX looks like on the web. So a lot of websites are using AJAX, obviously, and there's a lot of data that you can get and you can bring into your web applications. So one of the websites that we want to look at, and we are going to be looking at a ton of different websites. So the one that we're looking at right now is randomuser.me/API, and every time I refresh, it outputs this JSON content. If I go and if I do an inspect on it, so if I look at what the source code looks like, so this essentially it's outputting essentially a string value, so it doesn't look like it's very usable within JavaScript, and I'll show you how to bring that into your JavaScript. So if we have that content and we place it in here and we validate it on JSON, it's a whole lot more readable because obviously there's all of the white space has been removed, and that's why it's a little bit harder to read. So that's why sometimes it's also good to use these linting tools so that you can read the JSON content a little bit better. So what happens if I take this content and I place it in my JavaScript as data? So I'm going to just simply wrap it with quotes, and then let's go over to the console and we'll log out that data. So what do you think this is going to look like? Do you think that it's automatically going to look like JavaScript object, the one that we've been working with in the earlier lessons? So let's refresh it, and there we go. So we got all of this data, and essentially it's being returned back as one big string. And that's problematic because if you actually want to get, let's say, the title or the gender here, how would you go about doing that? So we saw with the JavaScript objects earlier, because they're JavaScript objects, we could do something like data results. And let me just show you that this is going to return undefined because data right now, it's one big string value. So there is a solution for that. So don't worry. There is a really good way to transform a string that is JSON formatted, so JSON valid string, into a usable JavaScript object. And there's a one method to do that, and it's JSON parse. So let's do data JSON. I'll do it all uppercase. So data JSON. So we want to transform this string into JSON. So let's do that. And the syntax is json.parse. So basically, this is the method that parses JSON, transforming the value as it parses through it into a usable JavaScript object format. So it's really easy, and it's magically can transform it. And you got to keep in mind too that it has to be valid JSON data. If you try to do it with data that's not valid, you're going to run into some problems. So there we go. So we've got our data JSON object. We've got results, and then within results, we've got an array. So what do you think happens now if I do data JSON results? You can see that we're starting to grind down and really return back some of this information that is available to us. So let's do that over here within the console. So we'll do data JSON, and we see we've got the results, and this is an array in here. And remember earlier we looked at that the JSON object can have arrays, it can have objects. So there's a number of different ways the data can come at you, and sometimes it takes a little bit of time to kind of get used to how the data is going to be formatted. But because it's an array, we want to pick up the first item in the array. And the way that random user works is you can actually get a whole bunch of results, and that's why it's returning the results in array format. So essentially you could loop through them, and I am going to show you more on that later on. So we're able to get that object, the first object here, and now we're ready to return back information that is contained within it. And within the console, you can see that you get this drop down of all the different object values that are in here. So let's say, for instance, you want it to get the gender. You could do it like that, and you can return back the gender. if you wanted to get the name. So the name is going to be a little bit more complicated because the name itself is going to have first, last, and title. So it's got another object contained within it. But easy enough that once we get the format, we can go through and we can get the last name, and that way we can return back the last name. And this is going to be the same. So when they do render out JSON information, you see that it is within that standardized format. So it's always going to be within that same format. So even though the entry information has changed, we can still go back to the page and we can return back the last name within this type of format. So what I want you to do now, pause the video and output the user's first name, last name, and let's do something like the picture. So first name, last name, and the thumbnail picture URL into the console. So see if you can do that, and you can use the source file with just this as the result, or you can grab it right from the web and copy it in. And later on, when we look at Ajax, of course, there is an easier way to do this. So with Ajax, we can simply pull that information in directly within our JavaScript and make use of it. So we don't have to create a separate variable that holds all of this information. We can dynamically grab that. And I'll show you how to do that coming up. So for now, let's output the first name, last name, and the thumbnail URL. So let me show you how to do that. So we've got the JSON data and we've parsed the data. So that's our first variable. And we can go into the console, we can do results, and we can kind of sift through here as well. And we've got it a lot better. It's easier to read over here. So basically what I've done is I've taken results. So I always need to include that results. You can put it into a variable so it's a little bit shorter. So this can be just person or something like that, whatever you want to call it. And that way we can do person, and we can do something like person gender, and that will return back the gender. And sometimes for these really large ones, you do have to kind of dig down a little bit deeper in order to get the data that you need to get. So what I had forgotten is that it's actually going to be the results, the first item that we want to return back. And if we had multiple results there, we could return back the second item, the third, fourth, because this is in an array format. So it's always boils down to those objects and those arrays and however that's formatted here. And as you can see, it could be either one, and you have to be ready to kind of traverse through and navigate that object to return back the data that you want to return back. So we know that we had person name, and we also, so let's do person name first. So we've got the first name and last name, so we can grab first and let's concatenate it together. Or you could have done it as separate console outputs. Either way is okay. And then this one is last. And it is important to practice how to get this information. So there we go. So we've got the first name and last name. And then last part of the challenge was to output that image information. So again, we can go into the results and let's go down and see how we can navigate to get that image information. So this was under picture and it's thumbnail that we wanted to get. So person, picture, and thumbnail. So let's try that out and refresh it, and there we go. So we're all ready to output it within our web page, and it's as easy as simply outputting it into our object. So let me show you how to do that. So one last thing, and finally, let's output the content into the output element on our web page. And if you're familiar with JavaScript, there's a number of ways to do this. So the way that I'm going to do it is I'm going to grab output and I'm going to put it into document. And you could use get element by ID because it's element, but let's try query selector. So to do something a little bit different. So with query selector, it's a lot more flexible when you're grabbing the different elements. So you always have to remember to specify if it's an ID or if it's a class before you grab that element. And then once you've grabbed the element, you can very easily put it into your output. So do that, and I'll do inner HTML. And we can equal it to HTML. And what I'll do over here is I'll get rid of this, and I'll do variable HTML, and that will be the first one. And then next we'll do HTML plus equals and the person's thumbnail. And we can even go as far as wrap this into an image with source, so using the image tag, and then bring that value into the source, and then break back into our object, close off that string, and let's see what it looks like. So there we go. So we've got our name, the person, all of their information showing up on our web page. So there's one other thing that I also want to go over before we conclude. And so we saw that we can bring all of this information from a string format into a JavaScript object format. And there are cases that you've got to do the opposite. So you might have something within a JavaScript object format and you want to bring it in a string format. And there is a method in order to do that. So let's do string, we'll call it string me. So this, what we're going to do is let's output some of this JSON object and let's put it into a string format. So the way to do that is that the method to do that is JSON and stringify. So stringify converts a value to convert a value into a string value. So basically, what whole JSON object can fit into one variable. And this way, if you're storing it to your as a cookie, or if you have a one variable slot to store it into, you can really easily squeeze that in. So let's we can grab the whole thing that we grabbed before, or we could just grab person. So whatever we want to do, whatever part of that JavaScript object that we want to make use of. And then lastly, let's output it here. So string me. So there we go. So we've taken that initial string, we've converted it into a JavaScript object, we've worked with it, and then we've also taken that one and we've converted it back into a string. So try that out for yourself as well. Get familiar with JSON stringify and JSON parse, and essentially they're just one way to parse it, another way to bring it back into string format. So get familiar with that, and in the next lesson I'll show you even more that you can do with this.